Companies don't refuse to change because they are ignorant. They refuse to change because they believe they are being rational. At some point, someone says, "We've already looked into that. The data shows no risk. Let's wait one more cycle." And at that very moment, the most dangerous decision has already been made. Do nothing. Have you ever noticed how some companies don't explicitly refuse to change but still remain in exactly the same place, year after year, while the world around them transforms? There is no declared no. There is no meeting where someone says, "We are going to be left behind." On the contrary, everything seems rational, calculated, professional, and that is precisely what makes this phenomenon so difficult to see, because companies that refuse to change almost never believe they are doing so. This is the question we need to face right from the start. How can smart organizations full of data, analysis, and experts manage to get stuck in their own thinking without realizing it? We are not talking about small or unprepared companies. We are talking about strong, respected companies with a history of success, experienced leadership, and well-defined processes. Still, something in them hangs. Something prevents movement. Something creates a silent resistance that doesn't appear in the reports, but dominates decisions. In the speech, everything seems open. Companies say they analyze scenarios, assess risks, listen to the market. Words like strategy, planning, governance, and rationality are repeated all the time. But in practice, few things really change. New ideas are discussed but rarely implemented. Alerts are heard, but almost always delayed. And important decisions get stuck in analysis cycles that never reach an endpoint. Not because there is a lack of intelligence, but because the organization's mind is already conditioned to protect what exists. There is a powerful illusion behind this, the illusion of control. When a company believes it completely understands its own business, it starts to confuse knowledge with security. The more successful you have been in the past, the more you tend to trust your own mental models. And this trust, which should be a resource, begins to turn into a filter. Everything that confirms the current vision is valued. Anything that threatens this vision is treated as exaggeration, noise, or unnecessary risk. The most dangerous thing is that this resistance does not present itself as fear. It presents itself as logic, like prudence, like responsibility. The company does not say, "We are afraid of change." She says, "The data still doesn't justify it. The timing is not ideal. Let's watch a little more." Every sentence seems reasonable. Every argument looks professional. And precisely for this reason, the refusal to change goes unnoticed even by the leaders themselves. At this point, the organization begins to live more within its own narrative than in contact with external reality. The market changes, customer behavior evolves, competitors adapt, but internally everything still seems under control. Meetings continue to happen. Reports keep coming. Results are still considered acceptable, and while nothing obviously breaks, the collective mind of the company is convinced that there is no real urgency. This is the deepest psychological aspect of this phenomenon. The corporate mind learns to avoid discomfort. Questioning the current model requires conflict, uncertainty, and risk. Maintaining what already exists requires only continuity. And human beings, especially in complex organizational environments, tend to choose the path that preserves emotional stability, even when this compromises long-term adaptation. Maybe you've already seen this up close. Maybe you attended meetings where everyone agreed that something needed to change, but no one took the first step. Perhaps you have noticed how new ideas die not through direct rejection, but through constant postponement. If this already sounds familiar to you, put it away for now, because understanding the minds of companies that refuse to change doesn't start by looking at numbers or strategies, but at invisible psychological patterns that repeat themselves in silence. And it is exactly from here that we need to move forward. Because when we understand how this mind works, we begin to see why refusing to change is rarely a conscious decision, and is almost always a mental state built over time. Before we go deeper, it's worth taking a quick break, not to break the rhythm, but to bring this reflection to reality. Because this type of content only makes sense when it stops being abstract. If at some point up until now you thought about a specific company, a leader you've already met, or even a situation you've experienced closely, this is no coincidence. This pattern appears much more often than people admit. Therefore, I want to invite you to actively participate in this conversation. Leave a comment or saying what caught your attention the most so far. It could be something simple, like, it all seemed logical. No one wanted to decide, or even, I've seen it happen. No need to elaborate too much. Sometimes just a few words reveal an entire pattern. These comments aren't just for engagement. They show how many people are seeing the same issue from different angles. If this type of deeper analysis, focused on organizational psychology, silent decisions, and human behavior in business, makes sense to you, leave a like, not as an automatic gesture, but as a clear sign that this content deserves to continue existing. The algorithm reads this as relevance, and it helps this video reach people who may not have stopped to think about why some companies just crash inside. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel, consider subscribing now. Here, the idea is not to talk about quick success, magic formulas, or obvious collapses. It's exploring what happens inside the minds of organizations, where decisions really come into being, or fail to come into being. If this topic interests you, subscribing ensures that you continue following this line of analysis, calmly, in depth, and continuously. Now, with that clear, we can move forward. Because from here on, what starts to appear are not just specific resistances, but collective mental patterns that make entire companies behave as if changing were more dangerous than staying exactly where they are. And that's when the story starts to get even more unsettling. Companies that refuse to change rarely describe themselves as resistant, rigid, or stubborn. On the contrary, they see themselves as extremely rational, organized, methodical, analytics. From the inside, the feeling is not of stagnation, but of control. Everything seems to be being carefully evaluated. Each decision goes through multiple filters. Nothing is done on impulse. And that's exactly why this type of company believes, with genuine conviction, that not changing is the smartest choice. The illusion of rational control arises when internal logic begins to replace observation of the external world. The company looks at its reports, its dashboards, its models, and concludes that it is making decisions based on data. Phrases such as, "We have already analyzed this," "The data does not justify a change now," or "Let's wait for another cycle," appear naturally in conversations. None of this sounds irresponsible. On the contrary, everything looks prudent, professional, and even sophisticated. Resistance to change does not come from ego, but from a deep trust in the system of analysis itself. The problem is that, at this point, control begins to take the place of adaptation. The company no longer asks what is changing out there, but what do our models say? It no longer observes emerging signals but confirms already known patterns. Reasoning stops being exploratory and becomes defensive. Not in an emotional sense, but in a cognitive sense. The system was built to reduce uncertainty, and any significant change represents precisely an increase in this uncertainty. Soon, changing starts to seem too risky. There is a powerful psychological trap here. The more sophisticated the analysis processes, the greater the feeling of mastery. The more data there is, the greater the impression that everything is being seen. And the greater this impression, the less willingness to accept that something relevant may be happening outside the current field of vision. The company confuses information with awareness, confuses model with reality, and he starts to believe that if something really important were changing, the numbers would have already screamed. But the real world rarely screams before changing. He whispers. It moves slowly. It changes behaviors before changing metrics. Customers change habits before changing expenses. Markets transform before changing recipes. And when the company depends exclusively on consolidated data to act, it always reacts late. Still, internally, the feeling is right. After all, not acting now seems safer than acting without sufficient certainty. This logic creates a pattern of continual postponement. There is always one more cycle to observe, one more quarter to confirm, one more report to validate. Every postponement is defensible. Every hold feels smart. And since there is no immediate punishment for not changing, the behavior is reinforced. The human brain quickly learns that avoiding difficult decisions reduces short-term discomfort. Within organizations, this learning becomes culture. Prudence becomes a central value. Caution becomes identity. Over time, rational discourse begins to become a shield, not to hide flaws, but to protect the emotional stability of the organization. Questioning decisions starts to require a disproportionate effort. Those who propose changes need to prove too much. Those who defend continuity need to explain less. The balance is no longer neutral. The standard starts to favor what already exists. And this happens without conspiracy, without evil intent, without villainous leaders. It is a systemic effect, fueled by internal logic. Another important aspect of this illusion is that it creates a false sense of maturity. The company believes that it does not change because it is experienced, not because it is stuck. Slowness is interpreted as wisdom, hesitation as responsibility, centralization as governance. Everything is given a noble name, and the more sophisticated the language, the harder it becomes to see that the real behavior is avoidance, not of risk, but of discomfort. In this environment, quick decisions become viewed with suspicion. Experimentation looks like amateurism. Continuous adjustments feel like a lack of conviction. The company begins to value consistency over relevance, internal coherence above external adaptation, and this creates a silent paradox. The more rational an organization considers itself, the less flexible it becomes. The more control she seeks, the less prepared she is to deal with real change. The most disturbing thing is that, at this stage, no one feels that anything is wrong. On the contrary, there is pride in the process, trust in models, security in logic. The company is not afraid. She feels calm, and this tranquility is dangerous because it anesthetizes the perception of risk. It reduces curiosity. It turns legitimate questions into unnecessary inconvenience. And, little by little, the collective mind of the organization begins to operate within an increasingly closed space. Refusal to change, then, does not present itself as explicit resistance. It presents itself as prudence, like rationality, like good management. And that's exactly why it's so difficult to combat. There is no clear enemy. There is no obvious error. There is just an entire system convinced that it is being responsible by not acting. A system that believes waiting is smarter than moving. A system that confuses control with security. It is from this point that the problem begins to deepen. Because when internal logic becomes more important than external reality, the company enters a specific state of mind. It starts to protect its past decisions instead of exploring future possibilities. And when this happens, resistance stops being a specific choice and becomes a cognitive pattern. A pattern that shapes all subsequent decisions, even as the signs begin to become clearer. It is exactly this pattern that we need to observe more closely next. Because once the illusion of rational control sets in, the next step isn't just resisting change. It's rewriting reality to justify why change isn't necessary. And that's when the company's mind starts to close for good. Once the illusion of rational control takes hold, a second mechanism begins to operate silently and extremely powerfully. Past success begins to shape the company's mind more than any sign of the present, not as memory, but as identity. The organization stops using the past as a reference and starts using it as evidence. Proof that you know what you're doing. Proof that you understand the market. Proof that you don't need to react in a hurry. Success creates a very specific internal narrative. He says, "We got this far because we made good decisions." This phrase seems harmless, but it has a profound psychological effect. Little by little, decisions that worked in a specific context begin to be treated as universal truths. Strategies stop being hypotheses and become dogmas. What was once learning becomes the rule. And when that happens, the company's mind begins to confuse experience with infallibility. This is the moment when the past becomes a filter. Everything that happens in the present begins to be interpreted in light of what has worked before. Market changes are seen as temporary cycles. New customer behaviors are compared with old patterns. Emerging technologies are evaluated using metrics from another time. The company does not ignore the new, but translates it into an old language, because it is the only one it recognizes as safe. The problem is not remembering the past. The problem is when the past begins to defend the present. When phrases like "this has happened before," or "we've seen something similar," start to close discussions instead of opening them. Success becomes the final argument. There is no longer any debate as to whether the scenario is really the same. It is assumed that it is, and this assumption drastically reduces organizational curiosity. Curiosity is one of the first elements to disappear in companies that refuse to change. Questioning requires energy. It requires admitting that perhaps something needs to be revised. But when success has built an image of solid competence, questioning begins to seem unnecessary. or worse, threatening. The organization starts to value the consistency of its own history more than observing what is happening now. Over time, this dynamic changes the behavior of leaders. Decisions are made more quickly, not because there is clarity, but because there is familiarity. Reasoning stops exploring possibilities and starts confirming expectations. Data that reinforces the historical narrative is highlighted. Data that defy it are seen as outliers, distortions, or statistical noise. The company believes it is being judicious, when in fact it is being selective. This process is dangerous because it happens without visible conflict. There are no internal fights. There is no explicit resistance. There is just a quiet convergence around a comfortable view. We know how this works. And the more this vision is shared, the less room there is for alternative interpretations. Collective thinking narrows. The company starts to think too quickly within too small a field. Another effect of prolonged success is a change in the relationship with risk. Fear stops being about losing relevance and becomes about losing control. Risking something new seems to threaten everything that has already been achieved. Error is no longer seen as learning and starts to be seen as an unjustifiable failure. This creates an environment where experimentation feels irresponsible, even when the market demands constant adaptation. At this stage, the company still sees itself as strong, intelligent, and prepared. And indeed it is, for the world that no longer exists. The strength built in the past begins to turn into weight. Experience becomes inertia. Confidence becomes rigidity. But none of this is perceived as a problem because the results have not yet collapsed. Past success continues to function as psychological anesthesia. The most disturbing thing is that the longer this logic persists, the more difficult it becomes to abandon it. Questioning the past starts to sound like questioning the company's own identity. Changing direction feels like an implicit admission that previous decisions may not have been as definitive as previously believed. And few organizations are emotionally prepared to deal with this idea while still appearing to be functioning. This is how success, which should increase the ability to adapt, begins to reduce it. Not abruptly, but gradually. Not out of explicit arrogance, but out of accumulated confidence. And when this trust starts to guide decisions more than current reality, the company's mind begins to close. From here, the next step is not just to rely too much on the past, but to create internal narratives that protect that trust. Stories that explain why external signs are not as relevant, why worrying data doesn't demand immediate action, because everything still makes sense. It is at this moment that reality begins to be rewritten, and that is exactly what we will explore next. After past success becomes a filter, and confidence begins to replace curiosity, the company's mind takes another silent but decisive step. It starts creating internal narratives to explain why it doesn't need to change. These narratives do not emerge as conscious lies. They emerge as coherent, reassuring, and socially accepted stories that help the organization maintain a sense of control, even when external reality begins to shift. Every company needs stories to function. They give meaning to decisions, organize priorities, and align people. The problem begins when these stories stop explaining reality and start protecting psychological discomfort. The organization does not ignore external signals. It reorganizes them within a narrative that preserves the existing logic. Problems are not denied. They are reinterpreted. Changes are not discarded. They are postponed. Alerts aren't silenced. They're softened. It is at this point that seemingly neutral phrases begin to gain excessive power. This is just a phase of the market. Our client is different. This behavior does not represent our core audience. The numbers are still within expectations. Each isolated sentence seems sensible. Together they build a cognitive shield, an internal system of explanations that transforms any potential threat into something distant, temporary, or irrelevant. The company begins to live more within its own interpretation of the world than in direct contact with it. External data continues to arrive, but it passes through narrative filters before generating real impact. Reports highlight what works. Problems appear accompanied by justifications. Trends are contextualized in a way that makes them seem less urgent. The organization doesn't lie to itself, it edits reality. This process is reinforced by internal social dynamics. Reassuring narratives reduce anxiety, avoid conflict, and preserve hierarchies. Navigating the dominant story begins to require emotional effort. Anyone who raises doubts runs the risk of appearing pessimistic, alarmist, or misaligned. Gradually, people learn which questions are welcome and which ones create discomfort, and naturally they start to avoid the second ones. Over time, the narrative becomes more important than the facts, not in the explicit sense, but in practical impact. What doesn't fit into the story loses strength. What reinforces the story gains space. The company begins to confuse internal consistency with truth, and the more coherent the narrative becomes, the less openness there is for alternative interpretations. This is a critical point because the organization still believes it is being rational. After all, everything makes sense within the story she created. There is no chaos. There is no apparent contradiction. Everything seems aligned. The problem is that this alignment is internal, not external. The company is organized within itself, but increasingly less synchronized with the surrounding environment. Another effect of these narratives is the constant delay of the action. There is always a plausible explanation for waiting. There is always a logical reason to observe one more cycle. The search for perfect confirmation replaces the need for progressive adaptation. The company becomes convinced that acting too early is more dangerous than acting too late. And this logic is reinforced whenever nothing explodes immediately. The most dangerous thing is that these stories are shared and reinforced collectively. They do not belong to an individual, but to the system. Meetings, presentations, and internal communication start to repeat the same frames. The narrative gains the status of institutional truth. Questioning it stops being just disagreeing with an idea and becomes questioning the company's very identity. At this stage, the organizational mind closes down even more. Not because someone decided to shut it down, but because the dominant narrative offers enough psychological comfort that no one feels any real urgency. Silence stops being the absence of information and becomes the consequence of a well-told story. A story where everything still makes sense, even when external signs begin to point otherwise. And this is exactly where the refusal to change deepens. Because when reality is constantly reinterpreted to fit the narrative, the company not only resists change, it becomes fearful of anything that threatens the story that sustains its sense of control. Change stops being a strategic option and becomes an emotional risk. From that point on, resistance no longer depends solely on logic or past success. She begins to be driven by something more primal and more powerful: fear disguised as strategy, fear of making mistakes, fear of losing control, fear of admitting that the narrative may no longer be correct. And it is exactly this fear, disguised as prudence, that we will unpack below. When fear is already embedded in internal narratives and the organization has learned to reinterpret reality to preserve control, an even more silent behavior emerges: structural risk aversion. Not irrational risk, but any risk that cannot be fully predicted, measured, or controlled. The company starts to confuse security with immobility, and this profoundly changes the way decisions are evaluated. At this stage, the central question is no longer, what can make us relevant tomorrow, and becomes, what can harm us now? This inversion seems subtle, but it redefines all internal logic. The focus moves away from adaptation and onto self-preservation. New ideas are evaluated not by potential, but by perceived risk. Changes are analyzed not by the cost of not making them, but by the immediate discomfort they can generate. The company's mind starts to operate in defensive mode. Innovative projects need excessive proof before they even exist. Different initiatives are burdened with requirements. Everything needs to be approved, validated, tested, reviewed, not to guarantee quality, but to reduce anxiety. The problem is that the external world does not wait for internal validations. While the company seeks total security, the environment continues to transform. This fear does not appear as panic. It manifests itself as exaggerated prudence, like constant caution, like a preference for safe decisions, even when those decisions merely maintain the status quo. The risk of making mistakes is treated as more serious than the risk of becoming irrelevant. And this creates a paradox. The more a company tries to avoid risks, the more vulnerable it becomes to inevitable changes. Another direct effect of this risk aversion is the gradual loss of experimentation. Making mistakes becomes something to be avoided at any cost. And when making mistakes becomes unacceptable, trying something new becomes unlikely. The organization begins to repeat old solutions to new problems. Strategies that worked in the past are reused even when the context has already changed, not because they are the best, but because they are known. In this environment, decisions are no longer made at the right time. Everything seems to require more data, more studies, more meetings. The company believes it is being rational, but in practice it is just delaying it. Excessive analysis functions as a sophisticated form of inaction. Thinking replaces acting. Planning replaces testing. And meanwhile, the distance between the company and external reality increases. Risk aversion also affects individual behavior. People stop proposing ideas that might fail. Bold initiatives are saved for a better time. Questions are asked in private conversations, not in official spaces. The organization does not lose talent immediately, but it does lose initiative. And without initiative, even strong companies start to become predictable. The most disturbing thing is that all of this happens without a sense of urgency. The company still works, still delivers acceptable results, still looks solid. This reinforces the belief that extreme caution is working. Each crisis-free quarter validates defensive behavior. Each problem avoided reinforces the logic that changing would be too risky. And so, fear becomes institutionalized. At this point, the company's mind no longer reacts to the world. It protects itself from it. Innovation is now seen as a threat, change as danger, the future as something to be controlled rather than explored. And when this happens, the organization stops learning in real time. She learns too late. This is where the refusal to change stops being just a strategic decision and becomes a collective emotional reflex. The company is not stuck because it doesn't know what to do. She is trapped because she is afraid of what might happen if she does. And this fear, although rarely admitted, starts to guide choices, priorities, and silences. From this stage, resistance deepens even further, because the next natural move of the organizational mind is to try to resolve the fear with more control, believing that control is the solution, when in fact, it has already become part of the problem. This is what we need to face next. After fear becomes institutionalized and control starts to be treated as a solution, something even deeper begins to happen within the organization. The company's identity crystallizes. What was once a living culture, adaptable and in constant construction, has become a fixed identity. The company stops asking, "Who are we becoming?" and goes on to say, "This is how we are." And when identity becomes dogma, any change becomes perceived as an existential threat. At this stage, decisions are no longer evaluated only by strategic impact, but by symbolic compatibility. Ideas are not rejected because they are bad, but because they don't suit us. Proposals are discarded not because of a lack of logic, but because it's not our way. The company begins to protect an internal image of itself, even if that image no longer corresponds to external reality. The organizational mind starts to operate with phrases that sound harmless but carry enormous psychological weight. That's not part of our DNA. We've never done it like that. That's not how we work. These phrases do not need to be said aggressively. They arise naturally, almost as a reflex, and they function as invisible barriers that limit the field of possibilities without anyone having to say no explicitly. When identity becomes rigid, change stops being a strategic choice and starts to be interpreted as a loss of coherence. Adapting feels like betrayal of the past. Evolving seems like abandoning the essence. And the more pride a company has in its own history, the more difficult it becomes to question whether that history still serves as a guide for the future. Past success becomes an emotional argument, not just a rational one. This process creates a specific type of blindness. The company continues to believe it is being true to itself, when in fact it is being true to an old version of itself. The world changes, customers change, expectations change, but the organization continues to respond with internal references. She is guided more by the narrative itself than by the surrounding environment. Another silent effect of this identity rigidity is the gradual exclusion of cognitive diversity. People who think differently start to feel out of place, not through overt conflict but through subtle misalignment. Your ideas generate discomfort. Your questions seem inconvenient. Little by little, they learn to adapt to the dominant discourse or move away emotionally. The company loses variety of thought without realizing it. At this point, culture stops being an adaptation tool and becomes a defense mechanism. Instead of helping the organization deal with the new, it serves to justify the permanence of the old. Values that should guide decisions become excuses for not to decide. Identity, which should evolve along with the context, becomes an anchor. The most dangerous thing is that this rigidity is often celebrated, The company prides itself on not changing according to fads, on maintaining principles, on not giving in to external pressure. And there is merit in that, to a point. The problem arises when this posture prevents any necessary adjustment. The boundary between coherence and stubbornness dissolves, but internally, everything still seems like virtue. The collective mind starts to confuse stability with integrity. Change feels like instability. Questioning feels like disloyalty. And so decisions that could reposition the company are avoided to preserve an identity that no longer matches reality. The organization remains itself, but in a world that has already moved on. At this stage, the refusal to change no longer requires complex arguments. It happens automatically. The system regulates itself to reject the new before even truly evaluating it. Identity works as a filter. What passes through the filter reinforces what already exists. What doesn't pass is discarded without much thought. This is where resistance stops being conscious and becomes structural. It is no longer a decision made in meetings. It's an embedded behavior. The company does not choose not to change. It simply can no longer imagine another way of being. And when the organizational imagination closes, the next movement is predictable. External reality begins to impose changes that can no longer be absorbed internally. It is in this shock that collapse stops being a distant possibility and begins to inevitably approach. This is what we need to face in the next point. When the identity has already crystallized and the organization can no longer imagine another way of existing, a final effect appears that is almost never noticed in real time. The company begins to confuse movement with progress. There is constant activity, busy schedules, frequent meetings, well-crafted presentations. Everything seems to indicate that something is being done, but in practice, nothing fundamental is changing. Energy is spent on keeping the structure functioning, not on repositioning it. This stage is especially deceptive because it eliminates the sense of urgency. After all, there is effort, there is work, there is delivery. People are busy. The problem is that occupation is not transformation. The company moves in internal circles while the external world moves in a straight line. And the more energy is invested in this circular movement, the harder it becomes to admit that it is going nowhere. The organizational mind begins to operate under a logic of operational self-preservation. Solving short-term problems becomes an absolute priority. Adjust processes, put out small fires, reorganize teams, review internal goals. All of this consumes time, attention, and resources. And while the company is dedicated to maintaining its internal functioning, it stops looking outside with the same intensity. Strategic adaptation is replaced by operational efficiency. At this point, any proposal for structural change becomes seen as inconvenient, not because it is wrong, but because it is not the time. There is always something more urgent. There is always a pending delivery. There is always an immediate problem that needs to be resolved before thinking about the future. And so the future is constantly postponed in the name of the present. This behavior creates a silent paradox. The harder the company works, the less it changes. Effort increases, but relevance decreases. The organization becomes extremely efficient in doing what it already knows how to do, even when it no longer generates the impact it used to. The focus narrows. The long-term vision is diluted. Success is now measured by internal productivity, not by alignment with external reality. Another effect of this stage is human exhaustion. People start to feel like they are always running, but never arriving. There is pressure, but there is no sense. There is demand, but little clarity of direction. This generates a specific tiredness different from common stress. It's the tiredness of investing energy in something that doesn't seem to evolve. And this wear does not explode. It accumulates. Leaders, in turn, often interpret this fatigue as a lack of resilience or engagement. They respond with more control, more goals, more processes. Attempting to extract more results from the same system deepens the problem even further. Instead of questioning whether the path still makes sense, the organization tries to accelerate in a direction that no longer leads to the future. At this stage, the company begins to lose something fundamental, the ability to reinvent itself, not because he doesn't have talent, but because all the talent is too busy supporting the present. There is no cognitive, emotional, or structural space left to experiment, make mistakes, and learn. The organization becomes cumbersome. And weight, in fast-changing environments, is a disadvantage. The most dangerous thing is that there is still no visible collapse. The company continues to exist. keep earning, keep delivering something. And this reinforces the belief that the model still works. The question, where are we going, is replaced by, how can we endure another cycle? The horizon shortens. The strategy becomes silent survival. This is where collapse starts to become inevitable, even without a clear external event. Because when the company can no longer change while it still has resources, energy, and time, it loses the chance to choose how it will transform. Transformation stops being a decision and becomes a reaction, usually late. This is the point immediately before final recognition, the moment when the organization, without even realizing it, has already crossed an invisible line. From here on, the collapse no longer depends on future decisions, but on the accumulation of everything that has been avoided until now. This is what we need to face in the next and final block, where the refusal to change finally finds its human and strategic consequences. At some point, usually too late, the company begins to realize that it is not just facing operational difficulties or market challenges. She realizes something more uncomfortable. She lost the ability to change when she still had a choice. The problem is no longer what to do. It's the fact that any path now costs more, hurts more, and requires disruptions that could have been avoided before. This moment does not come with sirens. It appears in low conversations, in decisions made with less conviction, in leaders who no longer speak about the future with the same clarity. Confidence doesn't disappear all at once. It wears out. And when the company tries to react, it discovers that it is reacting with old tools to a scenario that has already completely changed. Here, the refusal to change reveals its true nature. It wasn't rationality. It was organized fear. Fear of making mistakes. Fear of losing control. Fear of admitting that the model that has brought us here is not the same as the one we will carry forward. None of these emotions were made explicit when there was still time. They were disguised as prudence, caution, method, governance. The hardest thing to accept is that no one failed in an obvious way. Decisions were made by competent, experienced, and well-intentioned people. Precisely for this reason, the collapse does not seem unfair. It seems confusing. The feeling arises that everything was done correctly, but the result did not come, and this dissonance creates a deep psychological shock within the organization. At this point, the company tries to reconstruct narratives. Look for external culprits. It talks about a difficult market, unpredictable changes, factors out of control. Some of these explanations are true, but none of them touch on the core of the problem. The organization learned to justify its immobility before learning to face it. The human consequences become more visible. Good people leave tired. Those that remain protect themselves. The environment loses vitality. There is no longer room for real disagreement, only for functional alignment. The risk is no longer daring too much. It's not daring at all. And when that happens, the future stops being built and starts being awaited. The collapse, then, does not happen as an event. It happens as a silent acceptance. The company realizes that it no longer leads, it just reacts, which no longer influences the market, it only responds to it, who no longer chooses, just manages consequences. And that for organizations that were once strong, innovative, and relevant, is the most painful form of downfall. This process is not exclusive to large corporations. It is repeated in teams, projects, careers, and even in personal decisions. Whenever internal logic is used to avoid external discomfort, whenever control replaces adaptation, whenever silence is confused with maturity, perhaps the most uncomfortable reflection is this: companies that refuse to change don't believe they are refusing, they believe they are being responsible. And it is exactly this conviction that prevents them from realizing when responsibility has become rigidity and when prudence has become paralysis. If this video made you recognize patterns in a company, in a leader, or in a situation you've experienced, that's no coincidence. These processes are more common than they seem, and they only become visible when someone decides to look beyond the comfortable surface of normality. If you've made it this far, leave it on record. In the comments, write something like, "The mind doesn't change," "Control is not adaptation," or simply, "I've seen this." This helps turn reflection into real conversation. If this type of analysis makes sense to you, consider subscribing to the channel. Here the focus is not on the noisy collapse, but on the invisible processes that construct the end long before it is announced. And if you made it to the end, leave a like. Not as superficial support, but as a sign that there is still space for content that does not underestimate those who seize and that faces head-on the silent decisions that shape everything that comes after. If any part of this video bothered you, not in the sense of shock but in the sense of recognition, that's no coincidence. Normally, the truth does not scream, it provokes silence. If you felt that this content described something real, something that you have seen up close or experienced inside, subscribe to the channel now, not because of the promise of easy answers, but because the next videos continue to explore exactly this invisible territory: human decisions, psychological patterns, and silent processes that shape the destiny of companies long before any crisis appears. If you made it to the end, leave it in the comments. You can write something simple, like, "Control is not change. The mind protects itself," or, "I've seen this happen." These few words say more than long explanations, and show that this reflection did not just remain in theory. And if you followed this far, leave a like, not as superficial support, but as a sign that this kind of deep, uncomfortable, and honest analysis still deserves space. Because as long as silent decisions continue to be made, stories like this will continue to repeat themselves.